findings mean that the dose-response curve, in other words, the shape of the dose-response curve is not a straight line all the way down. And these graphs are taken mainly from the material I'm showing you. And this is extremely important because all the data at high doses, you see, was on the flat part of the curve. That means a small increase in dose produced very little extra effect. And as long as you're way up on this curve, way, way up, then you will never find the tiny part of the dose where you have very small amounts. And this is taken from our paper published in the International Journal of Health Services, which, by the way, is published in your department at Johns Hopkins University. And in this paper, you see that if you go across the nation and take the 9 census regions and use the announced radioactive releases from nuclear reactors and plot them up, it's not a straight line. And that, in other words, shows that we grossly underestimated it by using that slope rather than this slope. And the nature of this curve is such that if you decrease it by 10, the risk per millirad goes up tenfold. If you go down another 10, the risk keeps going up. And therefore, we have a strange situation that the weaker the radiation intensity is, the more deadly it is. And nobody anticipated this. And present radiation standards do not believe in this and have not accepted this because it goes against the existing regulations which govern all uses of radiation everywhere, and nobody wants to touch this. Although the Beer Committee of the National Academy called attention to it years ago in the earlier report, Beer 3, and so we now find that we have a situation where we have far greater health effects than we ever thought. Moreover, we can tie this directly to strontium-90 specifically because here we have a relationship which shows the link between low birth weight and strontium-90. And this is human data, not extrapolated from high doses. This was gathered by the AEC during their early years where they gathered skeletons from all over the world that you publicized. And then you see that the number of babies born underweight in New York State is perfectly correlated with an extremely, incredibly high correlation coefficient of 0.96, which is totally unbelievable. I mean, it's just unbelievable that any experiment in the environment can give such a correlation. And that is the nature of this enormous tragedy that we're faced because of the nature of secrecy. So the following point I need to make is that we are in a situation where, unfortunately, our government had to deceive the public in order to be able to continue the bomb testing. And as a result, they did not realize, for instance, that in Nevada, when the bomb tests went off in 1951, and the story in today's Times indicates, they did want to find out what would happen from bomb testing. Well, they never looked at the low birth weight data for Nevada. When you see this giant peak here, which only comes back down to the rest of the United States after the end of atmospheric surface testing, then you see that we have a far greater problem from chronic radiation than anyone had expected, especially since all standards have until now been set essentially only on cancer and not on other conditions that involve the immune system, because the strontium-90 goes to the immune system where the beta rays reach and destroy the progenitors of all the blood cells, and therefore lead to children that are born immature, whose future is impaired because low birth weight is associated with learning difficulties, with neurological damage, with immune system damage, and we have created a generation of children that are now born underweight. We see the first peak that I just showed you in the previous slide here, and now we see the tragic rise, which in New York in recent years has exceeded the high point of fallout from bomb testing. And that is frightening. It followed some accidents at the Indian Point plant, which released low levels perfectly within present guidelines that caused, apparently, strontium-90 damage to the mother's immune system, which causes her to reject the fetus as a foreign object. We've only learned about the role of the immune system in the critical aspects of pregnancy within the last decade or so. And so you can see it was the inadequacy of our knowledge that was so tragic because so much of it was concealed. Unfortunately, the concealment still seems to be going on, and this is one thing that I'm recommending your committee to investigate. Namely, the National Cancer Institute did a study in 1990 which was so arranged and the methodology used in such a way that it was practically guaranteed to find no effects around 62 nuclear facilities. And this was in 1988 and 90, not in 1945 and 1950. We are talking about today's deception that is still going on. And in the material that I supplied you, you will see what the nature of the deception is, but it's very simple. They said, well, we'll look at a small population that's irradiated in this county, and then we'll look at some control.
You gotta keep that microphone in front of your face.
Okay. Anyway, we'll look at this, the facility which has a high dose here, and then we'll pick some control counties. And it turns out that 3/4 of the control counties were right adjacent, as if the radioactivity stopped. But the latest DOE report submitted to you in February shows that they were able to trace the radioactivity 50 to 200 miles away from a source. So the methodology used was guaranteed not to show anything. And furthermore, and this is frightening, as one of the criteria they used in order to select control counties, they, aside from the normal demographic variables like sex, race, occupation, poverty, status, and so on, they used and picked control counties that had the same infant mortality or low birth weight, which was essentially guaranteed to show that there would be no difference in cancer rates later. And so this is what I'm planning to do. Namely, I'm offering some recommendations to you of things to do, and they are written down, and they relate to the need to re-examine and to urge or to request or recommend to the other departments that the newest data should be re-examined. The NCI study should be examined by independent people who are not involved in this cover-up. Like this committee is an independent committee. You can do it, or some subcommittee. Secondly, I urge that a new way be taken to set radiation standards, not by the users exclusively in a self-appointed committee, but in a public manner where the public and layperson can participate, who are the ones who have to take the brunt of the risk. And therefore, the biggest thing that you can do, I believe, is to recommend that we need to re-examine the risks that were involved, and above all, not to deny compensation to the victims on the basis of the high-dose risk estimates, which clearly, unfortunately, were so low. Now, the last slide that I wanted to show you is very important, and I'll just take another minute, this one. And it's rather frightening, because what the National Cancer Institute did, which minimized or practically eliminated the effect of radiation, is really very, very serious for the nation as a whole, because of the rising cancer rates and the continued rise in low birth weight that nobody knows what's causing it. But I will now show you a graph that is really astounding. This shows how mortality in the United States, unadjusted for age, declined steadily from 1900 to 1945-50, okay? And suddenly, beginning with roughly the time of the Bravo test, the first hydrogen bomb test that released thousands of times as much strontium as the Hiroshima bombs. Suddenly, there was a rise, an abnormal rise, which stayed high, and a gap developed between the projection and the actual number of deaths. Then, after a short time, 10 years or so, it began to try to come down again, but then there was another rise, and I have to say, the rises have continued in the last 2 years, completely counter to what's going on in most other advanced civilized countries. Mortality is rising rather than declining, despite all our medical efforts and all our expenses. And what this means is that this gap here, which has developed. By 1993, this gap represents 15.6 million people who died prematurely. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr.